Through the eyes of the sleeper, the world was always in motion, shifting and evolving in ways both familiar and strange. He was neither here nor there, suspended between reality and something far deeper, a place where time folded in on itself and secrets whispered through the silence. He was aware of his own body, though he felt as if he was watching it from afar. His limbs were heavy, unmoving, trapped beneath a weightless veil. He had long since forgotten how he had come to this state, only that it had been this way for what felt like an eternity. He existed in a space between wakefulness and slumber, where dreams bled into reality and memories twisted into impossible forms. It was in this space, this liminal world, that he saw her for the first time. At first, she was a blur, a flicker in his periphery, an echo of a face he could not fully grasp. But as the minutes, or was it hours, passed, her image solidified. She stood at the edge of his vision, just beyond reach, her eyes glowing with a light that pierced through the fog in his mind. "Who are you?" he thought, though no sound escaped his lips. His voice, his will, all seemed distant, like a memory of a forgotten life. Yet the question hung in the air, and he knew she had heard him. She smiled, though it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her lips parted, but no words came, only the faintest echo of something unspoken. She gestured toward the horizon, where the sky burned in colors too vivid to exist in the waking world. It shifted from gold to crimson, then to deep indigo, swirling as though the heavens themselves were alive. The scene was mesmerizing, but beneath its beauty, there was something unsettling, something wrong. His body refused to move, yet his mind surged forward, chasing after the vision she offered. He had no control here, and yet, he felt compelled to follow her, to understand what lay beyond. He found himself drifting closer, until he stood beside her in that twilight world. The air around them was thick, electric, charged with an unseen energy that hummed through his bones. It was the kind of atmosphere that hinted at something monumental, something inevitable, yet he couldn't place what it was. "Do you remember?" her voice finally whispered, soft as a breeze, yet carrying the weight of years. Her gaze locked onto his, and for a fleeting moment, something familiar flickered in the depth of her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or a shared memory long buried. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the shifting horizon. "Remember what?" he asked, though he knew it wasn't the right question. There was something larger at play, something he wasn't yet ready to understand. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on his chest, right where his heart should be. Her touch sent a shockwave through his body, and suddenly, he was falling through layers of time and space, through fragments of forgotten dreams and half-remembered faces. His mind fractured as the world exploded into a kaleidoscope of memories that were not his own. He was a child, running through a field under a sky of endless blue. He was an old man, staring at the stars from a crumbling balcony. He was a warrior, sword raised high against an enemy that dissolved into smoke before his eyes. Each memory was vivid, real, yet they felt distant, disconnected from his true self. He reached out, trying to grasp one, trying to anchor himself to something familiar, but they all slipped through his fingers like sand. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the fall stopped. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a vast ocean that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The woman was beside him again, silent and still, her gaze fixed on the water below. It was no ordinary ocean, the surface was like glass, perfectly still, reflecting the sky above in perfect symmetry. Yet beneath that calm surface, something stirred, dark shapes moving just out of sight, waiting. "Do you see it now?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper on the wind. He squinted, straining to see beyond the reflection, beyond the illusion. And then, he saw it, something massive, something ancient, lurking beneath the water's surface. Its form was obscured, but he could feel its presence, a presence that filled him with both dread and awe. It wasn't just one creature, but many, an entire world hidden beneath the glassy facade of the ocean. And they were watching him. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the weight of what he was seeing pressed in on him. This was no dream. This was real as anything he had ever known. The ocean, the creatures, the woman, they were all part of something far greater than he could comprehend. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. "This is where they wait," she said simply. "Where they watch." "Who are they?" he pressed, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "They are the ones who have always been here," she replied cryptically, her eyes never leaving the ocean. "The ones who sleep beneath the surface, waiting for the time to wake." He felt a growing sense of unease. "Wake for what?" "For the world to remember them," she said, turning to face him fully. Her eyes were filled with a sadness he couldn't understand. "For the sleeper to awaken." The weight of her words hung in the air, and he realized with a start that she wasn't talking about the creatures in the ocean. She was talking about him. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You will," she said, stepping closer. Her hand reached out once more, resting over his heart. "You've been asleep for a long time, lost in the dreams of others. But now, it's time to wake." With those words, the world around him began to shift again. The ocean, the cliff, the woman, they all dissolved into light, and he was falling once more. This time, though, there was no chaos, no confusion. There was only light and the faint memory of her touch. And then, in the stillness of that infinite space, he felt it, a heartbeat, slow and steady, pulsing in time with the rhythm of the universe itself. It was his heartbeat, and it was growing louder, stronger, pulling him back to the surface. For the first time in what felt like eons, he took a breath. And as his eyes fluttered open, the world came into focus. He was no longer the sleeper, trapped in dreams. He was awake. But the question that lingered in his mind was this: what had he awoken to? His eyes blinked open slowly, adjusting to the pale light that filtered through an unfamiliar room. The transition from the dream to waking life was jarring, and for a moment, he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The feeling of weightlessness still lingered, like his body hadn't quite returned to him yet. His fingers twitched, testing the air, but they felt sluggish, like moving through water. The room around him was dim, shadows stretching across the walls in odd shapes. It wasn't a place he recognized. He was lying in a bed, the sheets crisp and sterile against his skin. The air was cool, carrying with it a faint scent of something metallic, something unsettling. His heart raced as he tried to piece together how he had gotten here, but the memories slipped through his grasp like water through a sieve. His mind was still tangled with the remnants of the dream. No, not a dream. It had felt too real to be a dream. The woman, the cliff, the ocean, they were vivid, as though they had etched themselves onto his soul. He sat up slowly, his head spinning with the effort, and glanced around the room. A single window was set high in the wall, though the light that came through it was dim and gray, casting long shadows that seemed to creep toward him. The walls were bare, sterile, and cold, and aside from the bed, there was nothing in the room. No furniture, no door, nothing to suggest how he had come to be here, or how he could leave. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his feet touching the cold, hard floor. The sensation grounded him, bringing him back to his body fully. But there was still a nagging feeling in the back of his mind, as though something important was just out of reach, something he should remember. He rubbed his temples, trying to force the memories to the surface, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a faint hum, growing louder, a low vibration that reverberated through the walls. It was rhythmic, pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. He stood, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles, and took a few tentative steps toward the source of the sound. There was no door, no visible way out, but the hum seemed to be calling to him, drawing him toward something he couldn't yet see. As he moved, the walls began to shimmer, the sterile white surfaces shifting and warping, like the air itself was alive. The shadows that had seemed so still moments ago were now crawling, writhing along the walls, converging toward him. Panic gripped his chest, but he forced himself to keep moving, to follow the sound that seemed to pull him forward. The room twisted around him, the walls folding and bending in impossible ways. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but there was no way out. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his bones, and just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the walls parted before him, revealing a doorway. Beyond the threshold was nothing but darkness, impenetrable, endless. But the pull was stronger now, a force he couldn't resist. He stepped through the doorway, and as soon as he crossed the threshold, the floor vanished beneath him. He was falling again, tumbling through the dark, his mind reeling. But unlike before, there was no light, no sense of purpose. Only the endless black, and the weight of something heavy pressing down on him. His chest tightened, and he gasped for air, but the more he struggled, the deeper the darkness seemed to press in on him. And then, through the suffocating void, he heard it, a voice. Faint at first, just a whisper, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed all around him. "Wake up!" His breath caught in his throat as the words cut through the darkness. The voice was familiar, hauntingly so. It wasn't the woman from the dream, but someone else, someone whose voice tugged at memories long buried. "Wake up!" The words were a command now, urgent, demanding. His mind fought against the weight of the darkness, clawing its way toward the surface. And as he pushed against it, something inside him shifted. The weight lifted, the darkness peeling away like a veil, and for the second time, he opened his eyes. But this time, he wasn't in a bed. He wasn't even in a room. He was standing on a street, in the middle of a city he didn't recognize. The air was thick with the smell of rain, though the sky above was a harsh, unnatural gray. Buildings loomed overhead, their windows dark and empty, like the eyes of a corpse. The streets were deserted, not a single sign of life. He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if they belonged to someone else. They felt real enough, solid and warm, but the disconnect lingered. He felt out of place, as though he had been dropped into a world that wasn't his own. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure, just at the edge of his vision, slipping between the buildings like a shadow. His pulse quickened as he followed the movement, his feet carrying him toward it before he could think. The figure was fast, always just out of reach, darting between alleyways and disappearing into the fog that seemed to hang heavy over the city. But he kept running, the pull stronger than ever, urging him forward. He rounded a corner and found himself in an empty square. The figure was there, standing in the center, shrouded in mist. It was the woman, the same one from his dream. Her eyes, glowing with that same unsettling light, locked onto his, and for a moment, everything else fell away. The city, the mist, the strange feeling of displacement, all of it faded into the background. She smiled again, but this time, there was something more behind it. A sense of finality. "You're close," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Closer than you've ever been." He didn't understand. "Close to what?" "To waking," she said simply. "To seeing the truth." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning he couldn't quite grasp. But before he could ask her anything more, the ground beneath him trembled, and the city around them began to distort, the buildings bending and warping just as the walls had done in the room before. The hum returned, louder this time, almost deafening, and the mist thickened, swallowing her figure whole. "Wait," he shouted, but it was too late. She was gone, and the world around him was collapsing, pulling him back into the darkness once more. The ground crumbled beneath him, pulling him into an abyss so deep it felt endless. His hands clawed at the air, grasping at nothing as he fell through the darkness. The city, the woman, even his own sense of reality seemed to dissolve into the void. He couldn't tell how long he had been falling, time had lost all meaning here. But the sensation was different this time. It wasn't the disorienting, chaotic plunge he had felt before. This was slower, more deliberate, as if something was guiding him deeper into the unknown. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, each thump echoing through the emptiness. He strained to make out anything in the dark, but the shadows were thick, like a blanket of ink swallowing everything in its path. Then, without warning, the fall stopped. He didn't crash into anything, there was no impact, no pain. He just stopped. He hovered there in the nothingness, weightless and still. For a long moment, there was silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, from somewhere deep in the void, a flicker of light appeared. It was faint at first, just a pinprick in the distance, but it grew steadily, expanding until it illuminated a small, circular platform beneath him. His feet touched down gently on the platform, and he stood there, disoriented but unharmed. The light from the platform was dim, casting long shadows that stretched out into the void. The air was still and heavy, carrying with it the faint scent of something ancient and forgotten. The platform itself was smooth, made of a material he didn't recognize, neither metal nor stone, but something in between, cool and oddly comforting beneath his feet. He took a tentative step forward, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The platform seemed to stretch out in every direction, though he couldn't see where it ended. He was alone, or at least it felt that way. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. There was something here, watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He scanned the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source of the feeling, but there was nothing, only shadows and silence. And yet, the sensation grew stronger, more oppressive, as if unseen eyes were tracking his every move. His breath hitched in his throat as the shadows began to shift. At first, it was subtle, just the faintest ripple at the edges of his vision. But then, the darkness moved, coiling and twisting like living tendrils of smoke. From the heart of the void, something began to emerge. It started as a shape, amorphous and indistinct, slowly taking form as it moved toward him. His pulse quickened, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his feet remained rooted to the platform. He couldn't look away. The shape grew larger, more defined, until he could make out a figure. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were blurred, as though it were made of shadow and light intertwined. It had no face, yet he could feel its gaze, cold, piercing, and ancient. It stood before him, motionless, towering over him with an air of authority that sent a chill through his bones. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask what this thing was, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him in any way. And yet, he felt its presence in his mind, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness, like a distant memory trying to resurface. "You've come far," the voice said, though it wasn't spoken aloud. It echoed inside his head, reverberating through his thoughts. "But you are not ready." He staggered back, the weight of the words hitting him like a physical blow. "Not ready for what?" he managed to choke out, though his voice felt small and fragile in the vastness of the void. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it seemed to study him, though it had no eyes to do so. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until finally, it spoke again. "To see." The words were simple, yet they carried a gravity that made his skin crawl. He shook his head, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing felt real anymore. The platform beneath him, the figure before him, even the air around him, it all felt like part of a dream, a construct designed to keep him trapped in this liminal space. "What am I supposed to see?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The figure tilted its head, as though considering the question. "Everything." Before he could respond, the shadows around him began to shift again, swirling faster, coalescing into a wall of darkness that surged toward him like a wave. He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The platform beneath him was shrinking, dissolving into the void. Panic gripped him as the darkness closed in, and for the first time, he truly felt afraid. Just as the shadows were about to swallow him, the figure raised a hand, and everything stopped. The darkness froze in place, the void stilling as if held in check by some unseen force. The figure stepped closer, its form towering over him, and for the first time, it reached out toward him. "You are not ready," it said again, its voice softer this time, almost regretful. "But soon, you will be." The figure's hand brushed against his chest, and the moment it made contact, a blinding light exploded from within him. His vision went white, his mind reeling as the world around him shattered into 1,000 pieces. He could feel himself falling again, but this time, it wasn't into darkness. It was into light, bright, warm, and all-encompassing. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. He found himself lying on his back, staring up at a sky that was no longer gray and distorted, but clear and blue. The city was gone. The platform, the figure, the shadows, everything had vanished. He was lying in a field of tall grass, the sun warm on his skin, the air filled with the sound of birds singing in the distance. For a moment, he just lay there, blinking up at the sky, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His body felt lighter now, as though a weight had been lifted from him. But the questions remained, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Who, or what, was that figure? What had it meant by seeing everything? And why, above all, did he feel as though he was no longer the same person who had fallen into the abyss? He pushed himself up, his hands sinking into the soft earth beneath him. The field stretched out in all directions, endless and peaceful. But something told him this wasn't the end. Not yet. The field was serene, stretching on for miles, the tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. He sat there, catching his breath, trying to piece together the fragments of his memory. The sun felt real, the warmth on his skin undeniable, but there was a persistent tug at the back of his mind, a nagging sense that this peace was temporary. He stood up, scanning the horizon. The vast emptiness of the field seemed welcoming, but he knew better than to trust its calm. The figure's words echoed in his head, "You are not ready." It made no sense, yet it lingered like a puzzle he couldn't solve. He started walking, unsure of where to go, only knowing that staying in one place didn't feel right. The landscape shifted subtly as he moved, the grass thickening, the air becoming cooler, though the sky remained impossibly blue. There was no sound but the wind, no sign of life, not even a whisper of the strange world he had been thrown into moments before. After what felt like hours of walking, something changed. The ground beneath his feet felt different, firmer, and when he looked down, the lush grass had given way to cracked, dry earth. The sky above darkened, clouds rolling in with unnatural speed, blotting out the sun and casting long shadows across the barren land. In the distance, a shape materialized. At first, it was a smudge on the horizon, barely discernible, but as he got closer, it grew into something recognizable. A structure. A lone building, ancient and crumbling, standing defiant against the emptiness surrounding it. Its dark stone walls were covered in vines that looked dead, brittle, as though they had clung to the ruin for centuries, only now giving in to decay. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to avoid whatever lay inside. But that same pull from earlier was back, stronger now, drawing him toward the building with a force that felt impossible to resist. His legs moved on their own, carrying him closer and closer, until he was standing at the base of the building, staring up at its massive doors. The doors were made of old, splintering wood, etched with strange symbols he couldn't decipher. They loomed above him, cold and uninviting, yet somehow familiar, as though he had seen them before, in another life or a forgotten dream. He reached out, hesitating only for a moment before pushing one of the doors open. It groaned in protest, but it moved. The air that spilled out from inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and time. He stepped through the threshold, and the darkness swallowed him. Inside, the temperature dropped, the cool air biting at his skin. The interior of the building was vast, its high ceilings stretching up into shadow. Rows of tall, stone columns lined the walls, and between them, strange figures were carved into the stone, their faces twisted in expressions of agony or anger. Their eyes, though made of stone, seemed to follow him as he moved deeper into the hall. A flicker of movement caught his eye, and he turned quickly. But there was nothing. Only the echo of his footsteps, reverberating through the space. His heartbeat quickened as the oppressive silence closed in around him. Something wasn't right. The walls, the carvings, the figures, everything felt alive. Watching. Waiting. He reached the center of the hall, where an ancient altar stood. Atop it lay an object, half buried beneath layers of dust. It was small, barely noticeable, but it radiated a strange energy that sent shivers down his spine. His hand hovered over it for a moment before he brushed away the dust, revealing a smooth, dark stone, polished and perfectly round. The moment his fingers touched the stone, a surge of energy shot through him, like electricity coursing through his veins. His vision blurred, the world around him spinning violently as the ground seemed to drop out from beneath his feet. He staggered, gripping the altar for support, but the sensation didn't stop. It was as though reality itself was warping, bending around him. And then, without warning, everything went still. The spinning stopped, the air cleared, and the world snapped back into focus. But it wasn't the same world he had been in moments ago. He was no longer in the ancient building. The cold stone walls were gone, replaced by a vast, open sky and an endless desert of shifting sands. The wind howled around him, carrying with it whispers, faint, disjointed voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. He stood there, disoriented, the stone still clutched tightly in his hand. The desert stretched out before him, vast and unyielding, and in the distance, barely visible through the swirling sands, a towering structure loomed. It was far more massive than the ruin he had just left, its dark silhouette cutting an imposing figure against the stormy sky. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but he couldn't understand them. They tugged at his mind, filling his thoughts with fragmented images, flashes of places, people, moments he couldn't quite place. His grip tightened on the stone, and he began walking toward the distant structure, driven by a force that felt older than time itself. The further he walked, the stronger the whispers became, until they were a cacophony, impossible to ignore. His head throbbed with their intensity, but he pushed forward, the sand whipping against his skin, the wind screaming in his ears. As he drew closer to the structure, he realized it wasn't a building at all. It was a gate, massive, towering, and made of the same dark stone as the ruin. But this gate was different. It pulsed with an energy he could feel even from a distance, like it was alive, breathing, waiting for him. He stopped a few feet away, staring up at the monolithic doors. The stone in his hand hummed, vibrating with a rhythm that matched the pulse of the gate. His heart raced as the whispers crescendoed, their voices converging into one single, unmistakable command. "Open it." His hand trembled as he reached out toward the gate. The air around him seemed to thrum with anticipation, the sand swirling faster, the sky darkening further. He hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn back, to run. But there was no turning back now. His fingers brushed the surface of the gate, and with a deafening roar, the doors began to creak open. The sandstorm intensified, swirling around him in a frenzy as the gate parted, revealing an impenetrable darkness beyond. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead, and stepped through the gate. The darkness enveloped him instantly, thick and suffocating. There was no gradual adjustment, no slow acclimation to the black void beyond the gate. It was as if the very light itself had been consumed. For a moment, panic gripped him, the sensation of being swallowed by nothingness overwhelming. He reached out instinctively, but his hand met only empty space. And then, as suddenly as the darkness had come, the ground beneath him began to shift. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't air either. It felt like standing on the surface of something alive, something that moved with a purpose of its own. His pulse quickened, and just when he thought he might lose his footing, faint lights blinked into existence all around him. They were small at first, like stars dotting a distant sky, but they grew brighter, their dim glow revealing more of his surroundings. He wasn't alone. Figures, countless of them, stood in the darkness. They weren't solid beings, not entirely. They flickered, translucent, as though caught between existence and something else. Their forms shifted constantly, flowing like smoke, but he could make out the vague shapes of arms, legs, faces. Some looked almost human, others less so, their features twisted and indistinct. They stood in silence, watching him, their collective gaze heavy and ancient. The air buzzed with energy, a low hum vibrating beneath his skin. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. Despite their ghostly appearance, the figures didn't seem aggressive. But their presence was unsettling, their stillness unnatural. One of them moved. It drifted forward slowly, separating itself from the crowd of specters. As it came closer, he realized it wasn't like the others. This one had more substance, more definition. Its face was clearer, though still blurred at the edges, and its eyes, two glowing orbs of white light, pierced through the darkness, fixing on him with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. Without speaking, the figure raised a hand, palm open toward him. The stone he had been clutching since the ruins seemed to heat up in his hand, pulsing in time with the energy in the air. He hesitated for a moment, but something inside him knew there was no choice. Slowly, reluctantly, he extended his own hand, holding the stone out toward the figure. The moment the stone left his palm, it floated toward the figure, drawn as if by an invisible force. The light in the figure's eyes flared brightly, and a strange sound filled the air, like the low hum of wind moving through hollow bones. The stone began to glow, brighter and brighter, until it was almost too painful to look at. And then, without warning, the figure grasped it in its hand. The effect was immediate. The ground beneath him trembled, the lights around him flickering wildly as the figure absorbed the stone's energy. The other ghostly forms rippled in response, their shapes distorting and blurring, as though the very fabric of this strange reality was coming undone. His body vibrated with the same energy, his mind reeling from the sheer force of it. And then the figure spoke, its voice not from a mouth, but from within his head. "You have brought the key," it said, its words resonating deep inside his skull. "But the path is not yet clear." The lights pulsed, synchronized with the figure's voice, and the darkness around him seemed to deepen. He was no longer standing in a void, he was in a space that existed outside of time and reality. The figure gestured behind him, and he turned to see something he hadn't noticed before, an archway. Massive and ancient, carved from the same dark stone as the gates he had passed through earlier. The archway pulsed with the same eerie glow as the stone had, but beyond it was nothing but more darkness, thick and impenetrable. "You must choose to step through," the figure said. "Or turn back." A choice. But what was waiting for him on the other side? The figure didn't offer an explanation, nor did the strange, shifting crowd around him. They simply waited, their forms flickering like dying flames. The weight of the decision bore down on him. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to find another way out of this strange, nightmarish realm. But the pull, the same pull that had driven him through the desert, into the ruins, through the gate, was stronger than ever. He stepped toward the archway. As he moved closer, the air around him thickened, as though the darkness was pushing against him, trying to keep him out. His heart pounded in his chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. But he kept going, driven by a force he couldn't name, until he stood at the threshold of the archway. The figure watched him, its glowing eyes unblinking. The other figures remained still, silent sentinels in the dark. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay beyond, and stepped through. The instant his foot crossed the threshold, the world shifted violently around him. The darkness swallowed him whole, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he felt as though he had been ripped apart, scattered across the void. But then, slowly, the sensation passed, and the darkness gave way to something new. He was standing in a forest. It was unlike any forest he had ever seen. The trees were massive, their trunks twisted and gnarled, reaching up toward a sky that was deep purple, streaked with gold. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and strange, fragrant flowers. A soft glow emanated from the foliage, casting the forest in an otherworldly light. But the silence remained. No animals. No wind. Just the soft hum of the forest itself, as though the trees were alive, watching him. He took a step forward, and the ground beneath him shifted again. This place, it wasn't stable, wasn't real in the way he understood reality. But it felt more alive than the void he had left behind. And then, just ahead, a shape emerged from between the trees. It was a door. The door stood alone, unsupported by any structure, as if it had simply grown out of the ground amidst the towering trees. It was tall, far taller than him, and made of dark wood that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light of the forest. Intricate carvings spiraled along its surface, patterns that twisted and turned in ways that seemed almost alive, shifting slightly as he stared at them. It wasn't just a door, it felt like something more, something ancient and waiting. He hesitated, his pulse quickening again as he approached. The air around the door was different, charged with an energy he could feel in his bones. It was as though the very forest was holding its breath, watching, waiting to see what he would do next. His mind raced with questions. Where did this door lead? Why was it here? And more pressingly, what would happen when he opened it? Despite his unease, the same pull that had guided him through everything so far drew him closer to the door. His hand hovered over the handle, and for a moment he hesitated, a flicker of doubt passing through him. But there was no turning back now. With a steadying breath, he grasped the handle and pulled. The door swung open soundlessly, revealing not another forest, but something altogether different. Through the doorway, he saw a narrow hallway, its walls lined with mirrors. The hallway stretched on into the distance, disappearing into a haze of soft, golden light. The mirrors reflected not just his image, but strange, distorted versions of himself, some taller, some shorter, others twisted in unsettling ways. It was as if the mirrors held different fragments of his life, moments and possibilities he couldn't quite grasp. He stepped through the doorway, and as soon as his foot touched the ground on the other side, the door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed down the hallway, reverberating through the mirrored walls, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. The mirrors were captivating, drawing his gaze as he walked slowly down the hallway. With each step, the reflections changed, morphing from one distorted version of himself to another. In one mirror, he was a child, standing alone in a field, staring up at a sky filled with storm clouds. In another, he was older, wearing armor, a sword in his hand, standing at the edge of a vast battlefield. Further down the hall, he saw himself as an old man, sitting by a fire, his face lined with age and weariness. Each reflection felt like a memory, a life he might have lived, or perhaps still could. But the more he looked, the more unsettling the images became. Some reflections showed him surrounded by shadows, his eyes hollow, his face twisted in fear or rage. Others showed him standing at the edge of an abyss, staring down into an endless void. He tore his gaze away from the mirrors, focusing on the path ahead. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the golden light at its end remaining just out of reach. His footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, each one feeling heavier than the last. And then, without warning, the mirrors began to shimmer, their surfaces rippling like water disturbed by a stone. The reflections started to blur, the figures in the glass twisting and merging into something unrecognizable. A voice, soft but unmistakable, whispered through the air, barely more than a breath. "You are almost there." He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. The voice had come from the mirrors, but there was no one else in the hallway. He turned, glancing at the nearest reflection, but it was empty, just a blank, shifting surface of glass. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how cold the air had become. The temperature had dropped, and a thin mist began to creep along the floor, swirling around his ankles. The mirrors pulsed with a faint glow, and the voice came again, this time louder. "What will you find at the end?" He didn't respond, unsure if the question was meant for him, or if it was some kind of echo of his own thoughts. He kept moving, his pace quickening, his breath coming faster. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, but the light at the far end was growing brighter, more distinct. The mirrors, too, were changing, their reflections growing more frantic, more chaotic. Faces he didn't recognize stared back at him now, their eyes wide with fear or anger. They seemed to be reaching for him, their hands pressing against the glass as though they were trying to break through. The mist thickened, curling around him like a living thing, and the voice whispered again, more insistent now. "What will you choose?" His pulse raced, and his instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn back, to flee from whatever waited at the end of the hallway. But something else, something deeper, urged him forward. He knew, somehow, that the end of the hallway held answers, even if he wasn't ready to face them. He could feel it in the air, in the way the mirrors seemed to bend and warp around him, as though the very fabric of reality was shifting. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached the end of the hallway. The golden light was almost blinding now, spilling out from a door that stood at the far end. Unlike the first door, this one was plain, unadorned, but it radiated a sense of finality. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, the voice echoing in his mind one last time. "Are you ready?" He wasn't sure. But there was no turning back now. His hand hovered over the handle for a moment longer, fingers trembling slightly, as if the weight of the choice before him pressed down with unbearable intensity. The door seemed ordinary, no carvings or strange symbols, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It was as if the air around it hummed with anticipation, waiting for him to open it. Every part of him screamed to hesitate, to think it through, but the pull was stronger than his fear. He tightened his grip on the handle and turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing. Just a vast, blank space, an emptiness that stretched in every direction. It was not dark, nor was it light. It simply was. A strange kind of stillness hung in the air, like the pause before a storm. He stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a sound that echoed unnaturally in the emptiness. He spun around, but the door was gone. There was no wall, no floor, no ceiling, only the endless, silent void. Panic threatened to rise in his chest, but then something flickered in the distance. A spark, a tiny pulse of light. His breath caught in his throat, and the pulse grew, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. The pulse wasn't just light, it was a rhythm, a vibration that seemed to resonate through him. It was alive, in some strange, incomprehensible way. Without thinking, he began walking toward it, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. The pulse quickened as he moved closer, and with it came a faint whisper, soft but undeniable. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like a thought that wasn't his own, but it slipped into his mind so naturally he almost didn't notice. "Do you understand what you found?" He paused, the question hanging in the air around him. Found? He had no idea what this place was, or why it felt so familiar and alien all at once. The pulse in the distance continued to grow, becoming brighter, more insistent, as if urging him to keep moving. Another step, then another. The closer he got, the more the pulse began to take shape. It was no longer just a flicker of light, but something more. It was alive. As he neared, the light stretched and formed, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. It stood still, waiting for him. His heart raced as he drew near, but not out of fear. There was a strange sense of recognition building within him, as though he knew what he was approaching even if his mind couldn't grasp it yet. When he finally stopped a few feet away, the light pulsed once more, then faded slightly, revealing the figure standing before him. It was a reflection of himself. Or, more accurately, it was him, an exact replica, down to every detail, except its eyes. They glowed with the same light that had drawn him here, bright and searing. The two of them stood in silence for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the figure spoke, its voice layered with echoes of his own. "You think you're lost," it said softly, "but you've been walking this path since the beginning." His heart pounded harder in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure smiled faintly, but it was a smile that carried weight, as if it knew something he did not. "You were never meant to find the end of the journey. Only the truth you've been running from." He stared at the figure, trying to make sense of the words, but before he could respond, the light shifted again, brighter this time, blindingly so. The figure blurred and distorted, its form dissolving back into the shimmering light. He stumbled backward, his breath catching as the space around him rippled and changed. Suddenly, the void began to fill, colors bleeding into existence. The emptiness cracked open, revealing landscapes, cities, memories all swirling around him like fragments of a dream. He was no longer in one place, but many, all at once. His head spun as the world bent and shifted around him. And then, out of the chaos, a voice, the same voice that had whispered to him before, cut through it all. "Are you ready to wake up?" The words "Are you ready to wake up?" hung in the air, echoing through the shifting reality around him. He froze, trying to make sense of the question, but everything was blurring faster now. The landscapes, trees, mountains, cities, faces, all flickered like old film reels, overlapping, merging, dissolving. It was as if the world was unraveling right in front of him. But wake up? What did that mean? He wasn't asleep, was he? The figure that had been his mirror image was gone, replaced by the churning sea of visions. He reached out, but his hand passed through the fleeting images, unable to grasp anything solid. Panic bubbled up inside him as the ground itself began to shift beneath his feet. One moment, he was standing in a field of golden grass, the next, on a stone path that led into a dense forest, and then that too faded into a vast, endless ocean. He could feel something watching him, just beyond the edge of his perception. A presence. Maybe it had always been there, maybe it had been guiding him from the start. He couldn't tell. But it was closer now, the weight of it pressing down on him like a storm cloud about to break. And still, that question echoed in his mind. Are you ready to wake up? Before he could even try to respond, the images around him slowed. Everything stilled, like a moment of perfect calm before a massive wave crashed over him. In that frozen instant, he found himself standing on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a dark, swirling void below. The void pulsed with the same energy that had pulled him through the door, through the mirrors, through every impossible turn of this journey. The pull was stronger now, almost unbearable. The void seemed to be calling to him, inviting him to step off the cliff's edge and into its depths. His heart raced, and his mind rebelled against the idea of falling into that darkness. But something deep inside him stirred, an almost primal understanding that this was what it had all been leading to. Was he meant to jump? Was this the final choice he had to make? His thoughts spiraled, memories flashing through his mind, moments of his life he had forgotten, or maybe never lived. Faces of people he knew, places he had been or dreamed of, all tangling together in a confusing rush. The pull of the void grew stronger still, like an invisible hand urging him closer to the edge. And then, just as he thought he might give in, a soft voice cut through the noise of his racing mind. Not the distant echo that had been asking if he was ready to wake up, but a different voice, one that felt closer, more familiar. Not yet. The voice was his own. He stepped back from the edge, the pull of the void still strong, but now there was resistance. A part of him had made a decision, even if he didn't fully understand it. The void still called, but something else, something more important, held him back. The swirling images around him resumed their motion, but slower now, more deliberate. The world wasn't unraveling, it was shifting, realigning itself. The void below him began to fade, replaced by solid ground, an ancient stone path stretching out before him. At the far end of the path, a towering figure stood, cloaked in shadow, watching him. The figure wasn't menacing, but its presence was undeniable. It waited patiently, as though it had been there for centuries, waiting for him. He started walking, his feet moving without thought, drawn toward the figure. Each step seemed to bring a new wave of clarity, the chaotic storm of memories and visions receding. The figure, though distant, began to take shape as he neared, its features sharpening out of the shadows. It wasn't a stranger. It was him again, or a version of him, older, with eyes that had seen far more than he ever had. The figure stood tall, its face calm but serious, as if it knew something he didn't. And maybe it did. Maybe this version of him had already made the journey he was just beginning. You were never meant to fall, the figure said as he approached. Not yet. He stared at the figure, his heart pounding in his chest. What is this? Where am I? The older version of himself gave a faint, almost sad smile. You'll understand when the time comes. Before he could ask more, the ground began to tremble again, the stone path cracking beneath his feet. The void was coming back, creeping in at the edges of the world, threatening to swallow everything once more. But the figure didn't seem concerned. It simply stepped aside, gesturing toward another door, one he hadn't noticed until now. This door was different, simple, unmarked, but humming with the same energy that had led him through every strange twist and turn so far. Go, the figure said quietly. You're not done yet. Without another word, he stepped toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle once more. But this time, he felt ready, though for what, he wasn't entirely sure. As he reached for the handle of the final door, a strange calm settled over him. The figure behind him, the older, weathered version of himself, watched in silence, offering no further guidance, no more cryptic words. Whatever lay beyond this door, he knew he had to face it alone. The air crackled with that same energy, a hum of anticipation, but now it felt different, warmer, more welcoming. He turned the handle, the door creaking open slowly. Beyond, there was no blinding light, no vast abyss or distorted reflections, just a small, quiet room. Simple, almost ordinary. In the center of the room was a mirror, but unlike the shifting mirrors from before, this one was clear. It showed him as he was now, tired, confused, but undeniably himself. No distortions, no alternate versions, just him. As he stepped into the room, the door clicked shut behind him, but this time, there was no fear. He approached the mirror, his reflection staring back with quiet understanding. There was no voice, no pulsing light, no cryptic messages. Just him, standing before the mirror. In that stillness, a realization washed over him. The journey he had taken, the strange doors, the mirrors, the endless void, it hadn't been about some external quest, or a search for hidden answers. It was about him. His choices, his fears, his hopes, and the paths he could take. The figure, the void, the endless versions of himself, they were all part of him, all reflections of the decisions he had made and the ones he had yet to face. He stood there, staring into the mirror, and for the first time, he understood. The mirror shimmered slightly, and his reflection seemed to speak, not with words, but with a knowing gaze. The lesson was clear. The journey wasn't about reaching a destination or finding the end. It was about understanding himself, the choices he had made, and the power he had over his future. He stepped back from the mirror, a deep sense of peace settling over him. The doors, the paths, the chaos, they had been part of him all along. And now, he knew that no matter how strange or uncertain the journey might seem, the answers were never far away. They were within him. The world around him began to fade, the quiet room dissolving into a warm, golden light. As the light enveloped him, he felt lighter, freer, and more certain than ever. The pull he had felt throughout his journey faded, replaced by a gentle sense of direction, not toward some external goal, but inward, toward himself. The moral was simple, yet profound: the most important journey is the one within. No matter how many doors you open, how many paths you walk, or how many versions of yourself you see, the truth is always inside you. You just need to be willing to look.